Although Joanna and I were the same age, she was much stronger than me and handled bullies far better. She leaned more toward being an extrovert, while I was a quiet, introverted nerd. Joanna wasn't exactly a bully herself, but she was undeniably toxic and mean-spirited. She would constantly make sarcastic remarks about my poor fashion sense and lack of communication skills. Our parents attempted to enforce a civil relationship between us, if not a friendship, but no matter how hard they tried, we just couldn't connect. She would often try to boss me around, and I would always push back. The tension between us only subsided after I moved out at 15, which was quite early. After that, we only saw each other twice a year when I went home during breaks. Joanna didn't move out until she was 20, and since then, we've only met twice in the last 5 years. In keeping with our personalities, we chose very different careers. I work as a lab technician in a research institute while she became a flight attendant. None of that really matters, though, because what men seem to care about is that she's stunning and far more polished than I am. Nick, 27 million, and I've been together for 3 years. Last fall, he got down on one knee and asked me to marry him. I screamed yes, because why wouldn't I? I loved him with all my heart, and he was the most precious part of my life. This spring, we started planning our wedding. I'm not particularly good at organizing events, so when Joanna offered to take charge of the planning, I was thrilled and gladly let her take the lead. Looking back, I'm sure something happened during the planning process that sparked their connection, since they hadn't met before then, just 2 months ago. We had our engagement, and then we announced our wedding plans. That was the first time Joanna met Nick. Nick was my first serious boyfriend. Being an introvert doesn't make relationships easy. However, Nick was different. He seemed genuinely interested in investing in a long-term, meaningful relationship. After dating for 3 years, when he proposed, I was overjoyed. He wanted to get married right away, but I preferred a spring wedding, so we postponed it. I didn't share any of my plans with others until January when we sent out invitations for our engagement. The day after the engagement, Joanna called me and asked if she could plan my wedding. I was taken aback because we never had a strong bond growing up. She said she wanted to make up for her past behavior. I told her it wasn't necessary. We're not teenagers anymore. She insisted, saying she had more free time than I did and could use her contacts to get us some great discounts. Considering my busy schedule, I agreed to let her handle it. It was during the wedding preparations that I started to suspect she was hitting on Nick, though this is just my theory. I noticed some subtle changes in Nick's behavior. When I confronted him about it, he blamed it on work stress, claiming he wasn't getting enough sleep due to late nights at the office. While it could have been true, I couldn't shake the feeling that something else was going on. The day before the wedding, the event manager gave us a final walkthrough of the wedding arrangements. Joanna was with us, and the event manager happened to be one of her friends. That was the only time I noticed anything odd. Joanna was giggling and talking to Nick as if they had known each other for years, and their sudden closeness struck me as unusual. I had an unsettling feeling and wanted to confront them right there, but I hesitated, thinking I might ruin the atmosphere. The wedding was the next day, and after that, Joanna would be out of the picture. It would just be me and Nick. So I decided to let it go. On the day of the wedding, I didn't see Joanna anywhere. I assumed she was busy outside managing the arrangements. As I walked down the aisle, I finally spotted her sitting off in the corner, looking sad. I didn't give it much thought. That moment wasn't about her. I focused on Nick, who was smiling, but something felt off. He didn't look as happy as I'd expected. His hands were sweaty, so I quietly asked him what was wrong. He brushed it off, saying he was just a little nervous. As I stood at the altar, I couldn't help but notice Joanna's downcast face. She was crying. I was baffled. We weren't close enough for her to be sobbing at my wedding, and these were clearly not tears of joy. She looked miserable, as if she hadn't slept at all the night before. Then, the pastor began the ceremony by asking if anyone had a reason to object to the marriage. To my utter shock, Joanna stood up, tears streaming down her face. Everyone's eyes turned to her, and I froze in disbelief. I gestured to her, silently asking what on earth she was doing, but she wasn't looking at me. Her gaze was fixed on Nick. The pastor, equally confused, asked her to state the reason for her objection. Joanna knelt down, her hands clasped as if she were praying, and through her sobs, she said she was madly in love with Nick and couldn't bear to see him marry anyone else. I felt a wave of fury wash over me as I yelled at Joanna to stop. I rushed down the altar, screaming for her to cut out this nonsense. My parents quickly stood up as well, trying to lift her to her feet and defuse the situation. But the damage was already done. Even though Joanna had always been cruel to me, and I knew she could go to great lengths to make my life difficult, this was a new low. Still, I could have handled it, until I turned and saw Nick. He was also crying, sitting on the floor with his face buried in his hands. That's when my world truly stopped. I rushed over to him, asking what was wrong, but he didn't say anything. Joanna ran to him, lifting his face in her hands, and said, "This is our last chance, Nick. You have to speak up now, or it'll be too late. You'll be stuck with her, and she won't let you go easily." I yanked Joanna's arms and demanded to know what was going on. "Is this some kind of prank? If so, stop it, because I'm not finding it funny," I said, feeling the confusion and anger boil inside me. By now, everyone watching could tell what was happening. The entire crowd was glued to the scene, no doubt thrilled by the drama and already thinking of how they'd gossip about it for weeks to come. Nick wiped his tears with his sleeve, then looked up at me. His voice broke as he confessed that he had fallen in love with Joanna during the wedding preparations. Hearing those words shattered me. My legs trembled uncontrollably and I could barely stand. It was beyond humiliation, like I had been stripped bare in front of everyone. Our parents rushed in to take control of the situation. We had already provided the guests with more than enough gossip material for the month. I was crying so hard I couldn't even walk, and my dad had to escort me out of the venue, while Joanna's mom held her, trying to comfort her. But why on earth did Joanna deserve any comfort? It was unreal. Later, Nick and Joanna admitted they had slept together just a week before the wedding. They initially decided to treat it as a one-time mistake and move on, but they couldn't stop seeing each other. Nick's so-called late nights at work were actually visits to Joanna's place. In fact, they had slept together the night before the wedding. Nick even admitted that Joanna was so beautiful he simply couldn't resist her. I couldn't believe I had almost married such a scumbag. Despite our parents being present, none of them said a word. They chose to stay neutral and uninvolved, which only made me feel more alone. I had heard enough of their twisted love story, so I rushed into the changing room to grab my bag and car keys, desperate to leave. Once inside, I caught a glimpse of myself in the mirror, still in my wedding dress. That's when everything hit me and I broke down completely. I was having a full-blown meltdown when Joanna walked in. I screamed at her to get out, but she just smirked and said, "Don't worry, I'll be out of here soon. My soon-to-be husband, Nick, is waiting for me outside." I called her vile, and she just laughed. "Oh, Nick calls me that in bed too," she sneered. I wanted to slap her for the filth she was spewing, but she wasn't done. "How could you possibly think Nick would marry you after seeing my perfect body? Have you even looked at yourself? You're like a flat tire, spongy, and don't even get me started on your terrible fashion sense. I can't believe Nick fell for you in the first place. He's way too handsome for someone like you." She slammed the door and left, leaving me devastated. I somehow pulled myself together and drove away from the venue. But I soon realized I had nowhere to go. I had been living with Nick at his place, and there was no way I could go back there. Desperate, I called a friend and asked if I could stay with her for a few days while I figured out how to rebuild my life. She gladly took me in. The next day, I received a text from a moving company, asking where my belongings should be shipped. Nick had hired movers to pack up my stuff and get rid of it. I was caught off guard. I had nowhere to put my things. I called my dad, and he offered to let me store everything in the garage. So, amid the overwhelming betrayal and heartbreak, I found myself house hunting. My friends were my lifeline during this ordeal. They helped me find a place, set up my things, and were there for me whenever I needed them. They've supported me so much through this, and I'm grateful beyond words. I don't want to rely on them too much and risk pushing them away. Though my wounds are still fresh, I need someone to hear me out. I've enrolled in therapy, but it's only once a month, so I'm writing this post as a form of self-therapy. I want to thank those who have tried to understand my situation. However, to the people who are blaming me for choosing a cheater, for not seeing the signs, or for allowing Joanna to plan my wedding, do you really think grilling someone who's heartbroken is helpful? It's not my fault that Nick cheated on me, and I don't owe anyone explanations. For those genuinely asking how I got close to Joanna and why I let her plan my wedding, the truth is, we started talking again after I moved out of our family home. She reached out and said she wanted to make amends for the way she treated me growing up. I never expected things to turn out like this. I wasn't particularly eager to invite Joanna to my engagement, but my dad wanted it to be a full family affair. Joanna didn't seem interested in attending either, but Dad insisted since it was the first big family event. As for the wedding planning, I've already covered that in my earlier post. I was busy and she had connections in the event management space. To those who ask how I didn't realize my fiancé was a cheater, I'd say this. If people could truly predict that their partners were unfaithful, there wouldn't be any divorces in the world. Negative people exist everywhere, but honestly, I don't care anymore. You reap what you sow. Now for the updates. Joanna and Nick got married last week at the same venue where I was supposed to get married. The audacity. She even emailed me the invitation card. It wasn't really an invite. It was just her way of flaunting that she got him. I ignored it and immediately blocked her. I showed it to Dad, the same person who had been advocating for family unity. Even though I tried to act strong, I was breaking inside. Thankfully, my friends came over with drinks and tacos to lift my spirits. I got completely wasted that night, trying to numb the pain. One of my friends suggested I plan some kind of revenge on Joanna. They threw out a few stupid but funny ideas just to lighten the mood. As one of my friends was smoking, an idea suddenly hit me. Joanna is a smoker too, but not cigarettes. She smokes weed. I know what you might be thinking. Who cares? Well, I don't, but her employer definitely does. Joanna is a flight attendant, and she's not allowed to use any illegal substances because it puts passengers' lives at risk. Apparently, they are considered life saviors. Joanna, a life savior? Yeah, right. My friend and I were baffled at how she hadn't been caught, especially since airlines run regular drug tests on their employees. One of my friends suggested that we anonymously tip off her employer and let them handle it. I wasn't sure if it would work, but I decided to give it a try. I needed to do something to get my revenge. I sent an anonymous email to the airline, giving them Joanna's details and alleging that she had been smoking weed during work hours. To my surprise, I received a reply saying someone would reach out to me for more information. The next day, I got a call where they asked for specifics. I made up a story saying I couldn't disclose my identity, but that I'd recently flown with their airline and noticed Joanna acting high, with red eyes. I urged them to investigate her thoroughly before taking any drastic action. They thanked me and ended the call. Honestly, I had low expectations that anything would come of it, especially since I hadn't revealed my identity. I figured they might dismiss it as a prank call. Update. Hey everyone, I know it's been 2 years since I last posted, and I wanted to detach myself from my past, so I stopped updating here and eventually forgot all about it. But I've been receiving a lot of messages from people curious about what happened after I reported Joanna to her employer. So here's the update you've been waiting for. After I lodged the complaint, I had mixed feelings. On one hand, it felt satisfying, but on the other, I started questioning whether I should have done it. I mean, ripping her livelihood away seemed harsh, and I couldn't ignore the fact that it wasn't just Joanna who was at fault. Nick was equally to blame for cheating. Eventually, I began moving on, thinking that I had dodged a bullet by getting rid of a cheater before the wedding rather than later. I transferred to a different city to start fresh. Almost 2 years later, just last month, I got a call from my dad. He said he wanted to meet, and though I wasn't keen on it, he mentioned he was in town, so I agreed. When we met, Dad told me he needed help with Joanna. I was confused, thinking, help with Joanna? Really? He went on to explain that Joanna had lost her job because someone had tipped off her employer that she was smoking weed during work hours. They ran a random drug test, and she was caught. When interrogated, she admitted that she had been fooling the system for years. Apparently, she had contacts in the lab who would manipulate her test results, making them come back clean. To keep them doing it, she would sleep with the guy in charge of the tests. These accusations not only cost her her job, but also her entire career. No airline would hire her again after that. The airline didn't report her to the police to avoid damaging their own reputation, but it was the end of her professional life. My anonymous tip had worked, but by then, I didn't care anymore. I had moved on. When Nick found out, he lost his mind. Joanna, of course, tried to save herself by claiming she was being framed by jealous colleagues who envied her good performance. I couldn't help but roll my eyes. Sure, Nick tried to stick around for a while, but eventually, as Joanna spiraled deeper into alcohol and substance abuse, he left her. She lost her job and her husband. To make things worse, she borrowed money from Dad to rent a place for herself, but instead of using it wisely, she blew it all on partying and self-destructive habits. Now she had nothing, no job, no relationship, and no stability. It seemed like karma had finally caught up with her. Joanna ended up living on her friend's couch until she was eventually kicked out. My dad brought her home and took her to rehab, claiming she had started to improve and wanted to restart her life. He asked if I could use my contacts to get her an office job, but I refused. Dad was disappointed, but said he understood my decision. After he left, my guilty conscience set in. No one knew I was the one who had gotten her fired, and I was unsure what to do next. Update 3. This will likely be my last update because I'm ready to move on from this saga. I helped my sister get a job, which felt good, but I realized that no one can save a self-destructor. I managed to get Joanna a position at a publishing house, but she started stealing books and selling them on the black market at a cheap price. She was caught and dismissed. A friend was about to report her, but I convinced them not to, arguing that it would damage the reputation of the publishing house. Dad has since given up on Joanna and kicked her out of the house. Now she's on her own, and I have no idea what she's doing with her life. This Christmas, I went back to my hometown to see my friends. I visited home briefly, and during the church service, I ran into Nick. The hallway was so crowded that we ended up walking side by side. He greeted me, and we struck up a conversation. I tried to stay mature and polite. After the service, he approached me again, asking if we could talk for a few minutes. We stepped aside, and he apologized. Nick admitted that sleeping with Joanna was the worst mistake of his life. To make matters worse, he tried to rectify it by marrying her, as she guilt-tripped him into thinking he had used her physically. He thought marrying her was the right thing to do. I simply told him that I had moved on. Then he asked if I wanted to accompany him to an art gallery the next day. Since I had no other plans, I agreed, figuring it was just a friendly outing. We hung out, and nothing more came of it. Just a normal day. Later that night, after getting home, I turned on my phone, which had died during the trip, and saw over 20 messages from Nick. They were all along the lines of, "Did you reach safely? Text me when you're home. I miss you. When can we meet next?" I ignored them. Over the next few days, the messages kept coming. Nick kept checking in on me and even started saying he missed me and wished we could get back together. Eventually, I had enough and told him I'd moved on and didn't want to stay in touch. He got defensive and asked, "If you weren't interested, why did you go to the art gallery with me?" I told him to grow up, that it didn't mean anything. His ego was clearly hurt, and he hung up the call. A week later, I got a call at 2 a.m. It startled me, and I answered, thinking it might be an emergency. It was Nick. He casually said there was no emergency, he just wanted to check on me. I started yelling at him, and my boyfriend, who was sleeping beside me, took the phone and gave Nick a piece of his mind. That was the end of it. My boyfriend is a sleep enthusiast, and he doesn't take kindly to anyone disturbing his precious slumber. Let's just say what he said to Nick wasn't exactly polite, but it got the message across. After that night, Nick never bothered me again. He finally understood that I had truly moved on. I never felt the need to tell Nick I had a boyfriend. He's irrelevant to my life now, and I owe him no explanations. I won't share much about my current boyfriend because I don't want to jinx anything, but I will say that I'm incredibly thankful. Nick's cheating, while painful, ultimately led me to someone so much better. Heartbreak isn't the end. Sometimes, it's the beginning of something far more beautiful. I'll be deleting this post in a few days, but I wanted to provide closure to all the kind people who have checked in on me throughout this journey. Thank you all for your love and support.